Welcome to our first event in our new space. Traditionally, we've done what's known as the Liberty Salons at the Gonzo Gallery, and the goal is to bring in engaging, interesting people to talk about things that they're passionate about. And this is our first new talk this year, and I'm really happy to introduce Peter Hale from the Ginsberg Trust. Woo! Curator Yuri Zupancic, who's put on this show here. And then Paul Miller, who's working on a film on Allen Ginsberg.
Music project.
I'm producing, yeah.
It's a music project.
Yeah.
Okay. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the show that we have on display right now is called Flower Power, Firepower, and showcasing the works of William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg. And one of the cool things about the show that I'm really excited about is that these guys were such powerful, influential people for the beat movement, which then influenced the counterculture and influenced Hunter Thompson and had a huge impact on America. And one of the interesting things about this show is their divergent philosophies. And the cool thing is that they were best friends for 50 years. And they could push each other and argue with each other, but they remained close. And so that's an idea that we want to talk about because it's so important today to have dialogue and different points of view. And so on that note, I'll pass it on.
Jump in.
Yeah,
actually, that's a good sort of jumping off point. Like how long they knew each other was 50. Like
Let's talk loud.
We're going to project here, but I think it was like 60 years. They met in 1943. William and Allen met before either of them had met Kerouac. But so that's like 65 years they were friends, something like that. Allen was 16 years old. William was 32. William was 32. Allen was 16. Allen's stepmom had said she always thought William was just a little bit too old for Allen, but that didn't obviously stop them being very close for the rest of their life. I think there was only two periods where they got rather distant, and that was 1961, right when William met Brian Geisen, and sort of as Allen feared, Brian Geisen became his replacement, and Brian really introduced William to a lot of cut-up artwork, and that's sort of where William's cut-up exploration begins, and his real exploration into art. Probably the next 10 years were very distant with Allen, but then after that, William moves to New York City in the early 70s, and they were very tight after that, ever since. So they both died in 1997, 2 months apart. Allen died in April, William died in August, so I guess that's 4 months apart. Close enough. Fascinating. So,
Okay, and I just want to jump in for a moment to give a little bit of art historical context. From my perspective, by the way, DJ neglected to mention, my performer name is DJ Spooky. It's a long story. If you're into electronic music, I've been a music producer for many years, and I've worked with people like Yoko Ono, and I actually did some of the first DJ remixes of Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs. And I've worked with pretty much a broad spectrum, everything from Wu-Tang Clan on over to Metallica. It's a long story, I'm a producer. So I'm here this summer producing a project called The Fall of America, based on, actually, Jackie, you have the book, can you hold up? There's you see, wonderful Jackie, has a Healing Award here. So this is a classic book, and it's the 50th anniversary, if I remember correctly.
the 50th, exactly, yeah.
So, so the friendship of these two major figures in American culture actually influenced the art world and the music composers world, and I'll just give you a couple examples. So people like Francesco Clemente, on one hand, did a press with Allen Ginsberg called Hanuman Press, and a lot of painters would hang out with Ginsberg and be inspired by the poetry. Probably the most famous is Roy Lichtenstein, and Lichtenstein's prints were taken from kind of being an inspiration from the poems. So by way of kind of thinking about the 21st century, here we are. We're in a hyper-capitalist moment. A microorganism, the coronavirus / COVID-19, has brought the entire global capitalist structure to a grinding halt, which could actually be a chapter out of a William S. Burroughs novel, like Cities of the Red Knight or Nova Express. And so my DJ nickname is DJ Spooky the Subliminal Kid, which is a character in one of his novels. So I met these gentlemen in downtown New York context and have always been very influenced by the collage aspect and also the notion of how certain aspects of French poetry, Rimbaud, Jean Cocteau, influenced their thinking on sort of surrealism, free verse, associative memory, and above all, the sort of cut-up technique that Burroughs kind of used to open a new space in literature based on collage.
Yeah, and much more than literature. I want to cut in here about the cut-ups, that was a breakthrough that Burroughs innovated with Brian Gysin, who you mentioned, in 1959, I believe. And basically the technique is to cut up a text in a random order and reposition the things to create a new text. And it's basically a way to force yourself to read between the lines, force yourself to create new meanings and find new meanings without being stuck in a kind of linear, traditional language perspective, and really just break outside the box in a whole new way. And I could go on and on about all the ways that these guys broke outside the box with their artistic creations. But since you mentioned the cut-ups, that was a technique that was most famously applied to literature by Burroughs and Gysin, and I mean, even David Bowie wrote an album with the cut-up technique, and so this is, speaking of music, there's been numerous, yourself included, but many very interesting and innovative musicians that got their influence directly from this one little invention that happened by accident, cutting up some newspapers. And as far as all of their innovations and things, most of the attention they get is for their literature. But one of our priorities of this show is to show that they did so much more than that. And so, for example, with the cut-up technique, you see some of Burroughs in action there. Some photos of Burroughs taking photos of photos that Burroughs took, just to hint at how far down the rabbit hole he went to try to observe reality and cut it up and reorganize it just to give himself a fresh perspective, because he felt so jaded, and he felt that most of the information that is being fed to us and most of the entertainment that's being fed to us in our news and everything else was so filtered and so designed to be read one certain way that he demanded of himself to find new ways to view those things and to find and to create new meanings. And I think that with that in mind, of looking everything they did, could say that that desire to look deeply, to cut into the fabric of not only literature and visual art, but of news and our everyday life, and try to assemble some new ways to understand that. And so I think I just want to encourage people who check out this show and look more into these guys' work to just bear that in mind, that these are all exercises in just kind of, breaking free of a conditioned way to look at things and find new ways to look at things and just enlarge our understanding and conversations.
When did William start doing the audio cut-up stuff? Is that all happening around the same time?
That was right after.
Like here now, but
He was doing stuff
in the same period of those photos in the 60s in Tangier and in Paris. He started cutting up tapes, and you probably studied that extensively.
Yeah, so just to unpack some of the issues that they were talking about, one of the things that Burroughs really innovated was this notion of using mass media as a kind of creating a dissonant wave of counter-information. So he felt that in the 1960s, mass culture and mass information was shaping the narrative of the time, and he wanted to create an anti-virus. He coined the term language as a virus. So he's influenced people like Bjork, Laurie Anderson, Philip Glass, myself, all sorts of different people from the New York context. And he had a studio on the Bowery, also called The Bunker, at 222 The Bowery. If anybody knows New York, it's across from the New Museum. And so a whole bunch of people would come by his loft and hang out, like Bob Dylan would hang out. And in fact, Bob Dylan helped fund some of Allen Ginsberg's poetry because he helped fund them to go across the U.S., for example.
Right. I mean, that was a decade before. But yeah,
Decade, yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So the idea was that the counterculture of that time was really doing a critique of mass culture in the Vietnam War and the notion of permanent war as part of the American military-industrial complex. So Burroughs felt that his cutting up the media would allow new meanings to sort of pop out of this unexpected association. So he would take newspaper articles, he would take all sorts of critiques of the war or this or that, condense it and then read it and then cut that up. And the intent was to show that literature could show infinite possibilities in worlds. So non-linear imagination. But amusingly enough, here we are in 2020, and we're actually being affected by non-linear processes such as climate change. We've unleashed billions of years worth of carbon in just a short amount of time. The actual weather patterns are going crazy. This is supposed to be the hottest summer in human history. Siberia is on fire. It's 100 degrees near the North Pole, and the list could go on. So all of these are themes that are eerily resonant with Burroughs' writing. It's slightly dark, just putting that out there, but it's also
it's realist.
Yeah, and Ginsberg's Hale and other things open up other portals, which I think these two writers changed the course of American history. I actually think they helped give us better tools to think of the culture war, so to speak. And the right wing, one could argue, lost the culture war, and thus one could argue now the only way that they have any impact on the culture is through stuff like stacking the Supreme Court, voter suppression, and other issues that will gerrymandering and so on. Nobody likes their ideas, so
they can't win on ideas anymore. So
right.
They've given that up. So
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the environmentalist aspect too, and maybe that's a good topic that we could start with chatting about. And I'll just throw out, that Burroughs is not so known for, but he was an avid environmentalist. Like 1965, he said, all of my work is directed against those who, through stupidity or design, are bent on destroying the planet or rendering it uninhabitable. So basically saying that everything he did was an effort to save the planet from, forces that were destroying it. And just to put that out there, but I would like to hear from you, Peter, what you have to say about Alan's efforts and reactions and how he fits into the environmentalist picture we're seeing today.
Well, right. I mean, he was everywhere. I mean, his earliest protests were really more anti-Vietnam War in 1965 in Berkeley, famously, with those protests. But he was at the first Earth Day celebration in 1970 in Philadelphia, and he actually reads it's in the Fall of America poems. It's called Friday the 13th. There's a documentary on the first Earth Day. In fact, it's kind of hard to find, but if you just do Ginsberg and Earth Day, it should come up. But he's a dramatic reading of that poem, and the middle line is mind pollution equals sky pollution. So he's sort of making this equivalence of sort of our mental illness of our culture is sort of what's driving this sort of thing. And he goes further to kind of break it down in the poem. So by then it's clearly on his mind. And so much of Fall of America poems actually is, as he crisscrosses the country, he's seeing like all the devastation of sort of the petrochemical industry juxtaposed to all the beautiful landscapes. So but there's like the real hideousness. There's one like Cleveland, the Flats. I mean, that's before the flats in Cleveland got cleaned up. I'm not sure if that was the Cuyahoga River that caught fire.
Oh yeah,
or that was but
Love Canal.
Love Canal was like that was completely. But there was the river outside Cleveland was catching fire periodically, and this was just belching smoke and everything, right? And Hale just captures that so horrifically, and then he will move on to another poem talking about the pristine glacier park in Montana. So that's sort of environmentally powerful about that book. But by 1978. He's living in Boulder, Colorado, and they're routinely protesting Rocky Flats nuclear. It's the nuclear trigger for plutonium bombs factory that they were having a lot of problems, but anyway, they were trying to get it to shut down, and in the end, it actually did work. But they were meditating on the supply rail tracks that would bring all the supplies coming in. So they got arrested several times, but for about 4 summers in a row, they were out there pretty much every week protesting that.
But while that stuff was going on, you have to remember the nuclear industry, actually, Greenpeace, other kinds of political activist groups were up in arms about America's nuclear testing. And Colorado is actually where they have a lot of missile silos, and there's actually a tremendous amount of crazy hidden fortresses and like missile stuff in Colorado, and a lot of that actually is not well maintained. So Rocky Mountain Flats became notorious, and a lot of people call it America's Chernobyl because it caught on fire, and all this crazy plutonium and uranium spread around Boulder. And in fact, now they're kind of hiding that, and they just built all these condos over it and made it a nature preserve. So if anybody wants some plutonium with their breakfast, feel free. So Ginsberg would actually sit on the train tracks, blocking the trains filled with plutonium and uranium, and they would meditate, and they'd have like a Seder, which is a Jewish tradition. And so they also did that in the middle of starting Naropa. Naropa is a very well-known poetry kind of labs, and it's been very much a part of Colorado culture for the last, couple decades.
Right, 50 years? 40 years, 45 years, yeah.
So he was also a practicing Jewish Buddhist, which was something that's also kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of meat here for this notion of alternative culture. And one of the most famous collaborations Burroughs did was with Kurt Cobain from Nirvana, where Kurt Cobain played guitar while Burroughs read from several of his works. So these guys, I'm sure, I see some millennials here maybe, but Nirvana was big in the 90s, just for millennials. So those kinds of situations really showed that the arts in America could really have that kind of interdisciplinary, kind of powerful movement between mediums, because a lot of us live in those silos. Painters over here, sculptors over here, data scientists over here, anti-nuclear activists over here. So these guys really brought it together.
Yeah.
I'd like to chime in on that. Yeah. One of the things that I think is really cool about these artists is not only that they were, writers and poets and making visual art, but that also their lives themselves were works of art. The way they lived and the connections they made and the travels and the connections that they made. It wasn't just what they produced, it was how they lived their lives.
Right.
Activists, right? Were they activists?
An activist, yeah.
Activists. And Alan knew everybody, William knew everybody. And it was like when Timothy Leary was trying to get interesting people to take LSD and mushrooms for part of his Harvard experiment, he was like, get to Allen Ginsberg's address book. And that opened basically up to everybody from like Thelonious Monk to Jack Kerouac, of course, but any sort of like, every cross society, highest to lowest.
Yeah, and there was an exhibition in Karlsruhe, Germany, a few years back called "The Name Is Burroughs," and the whole kind of theory behind this exhibition, curated by Udo Breger, was that basically you could look at Burroughs' work, his visual art, his writing, and all this, and get a message. But what happened at the exhibition was an enormous assembly of over 2,000 objects, from album covers to zines to t-shirts to other works of art of people inspired by him. And you put all these works of art, etc., together that were all influenced by Burroughs, and you actually got a very profound picture of Burroughs himself and his message. It was kind of a portrait of him through his influences. And I found that really interesting. And I would be very curious to see what would happen if there was a similar exhibition with Ginsberg put together, and imagining all of these ephemera and works of art that were influenced by him put together. Would you see Alan in that?
Yeah, sure. Right. I mean, this is the music collaborations, the art collaborations.
Did he do something
So
with
extensive,
Bob Dylan?
Did he do stuff?
Oh, yeah.
We actually have a CD in there. In 1971, they recorded at the Record Plant in New York. Alan did his first blues record. Dylan plays on a couple of tracks. He plays piano and guitar, but it's fun stuff. the producer Hal Willner. The producer Hal Willner
Rest
was pretty
in peace.
Rest in peace. He just passed away 3 months ago. COVID, but he's sort of famous for doing tribute record projects. So one of his first ones was having a variety of artists interpret Kurt Weill's songs. The most recent one he did was interpreting Mark Bolan's songs. It's like a double LP. But you name it, from people from U2 to Tom Waits.
Who would you imagine today? Sorry to interrupt, but who would you imagine Alan collaborating with in right now?
Well, we're working on that.
Well, we're working on that.
Yeah, but I'm saying if you would sit around here
Angelique
living and
Kidjo,
dancing.
Derek Carter, Saul Williams. Anyway, so that list kind of goes on. But anyway, when Willner was putting together a box set for Alan, and they asked, we're going to ask Dylan to approve reissuing a couple of those tracks. The word got around to Hal that Dylan's like, oh God, Alan's not releasing those again, is he? Like that. But so I mean, I don't know if Dylan was enormously fond of some of the collaborations, but Alan just wanted to repeat that as many times as possible.
Well, if anybody's seen any of Bob Dylan's paintings, I don't know. You could use some help. But
in fact, actually, just before Alan died, he had figured they were supposed to do a collaboration together. It was going to be an MTV Unplugged, of all things, with Alan and his musician friends doing a lot of his poems. And Dylan, they were going to record in his loft space because Alan was getting sick. That never came to pass. Alan died like a month later.
And a lot of artists came and meditated with him when he was about to pass. And people.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a whole trajectory that America, if you think about the legacy, to me at least, of some of the avant-garde movements of the last 2 centuries. I mean, it's now 2020. If you look at the late 19th century, you had poets. Even earlier, for example, Rimbaud, Milton, if anyone's in the French scene.
Celine.
Yeah, Celine, that were highly influential in American, like the literary scene. And so what ends up happening is that kind of notion of poetry opening new places in the culture. I mean, don't forget, one of the most controversial aspects of Hal was that it was banned. Do you want to talk about that for a moment too? And like what was the indecency?
Yeah, right. Obscenity. Well, yeah, he was taken to court for obscenity. The book Hal and Other Poems was seized by immigration because it was printed in the UK. That's where Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who ran City Lights Books, he was having his books published in the UK. They were seized at the border because of obscene language. But it went to trial and it was deemed literary. But had that not happened, probably no one would really have known about the book. So it was like probably the best advertising you could get. And now it's going to sell over like 1 million copies, which is a huge thing for poetry.
Yeah. So, but that trial, they made a movie a little bit about that as well.
So, yeah, about 10 years ago, documentary filmmakers Rob Epstein and Jeffrey Friedman, who did the Times of Harvey Milk, and the Quilt film, the Quilt documentary, more recently the Linda Ronstadt movie. But this was kind of their first narrative film, which was basically the history of the Hal film, or the Hal poem. James Franco playing Allen Ginsberg, which was so mostly a film about that poem. So and then the obscenity trial that followed it. So,
but at that time, you have to remember the language of poetry. Who would have guessed that it would trigger someone like J. Edgar Hoover or people like Nixon? And they actually had secret police following them, FBI agents, so on and so on, because they feared that the poetry would trigger the beats to create some sort of social chaos. So amusingly enough and strangely enough, that trial was a watershed moment that allowed later movements like hip hop. Every other hip hop song is filled with whatever you want to, colorful language. I'll leave it at that. And so those kinds of things set the tone for what I believe some of the culture wars later on. And again, the right wing lost. There is a poetry, there is a literature of change that when people hear the colorfulness of this kind of writing, that it opens up, again, controversy. In the 90s, Hillary Clinton, amusingly enough, was one of the people principally involved in putting parental guidance recommended. Remember those little...
That was Tipper Gore.
Yeah, Tipper Gore.
Yeah.
Tipper Gore and the PMRC, right? Al Gore's wife. But
controversy.
Which then helped sell languages.
Right.
I mean, they sell records because the language advisory automatically attracted a teenage audience who were directly buying that.
Right, like you remember NWA? That was one of they had the song "Fuck the Police."
Right, Two Life Crew, I think, got in big trouble.
So all of that still in the shadow of the Ginsberg controversy about language and American the kind of uptightness that we would normally think of. I mean, it really would have changed the course of history if that had been found to be merit of banning, because people were able to create more and more colorful.
I mean, Burroughs also, he ran into some problems with publishing Naked Lunch in France well before the United States.
Right. I mean, Naked Lunch Trial was 1964 in Boston, right? And then did it first fail, and then I forget how it went.
There were some legal actions as well.
Yeah.
I'll mention the Hunter Thompson connection with this also.
Oh yeah.
Some of the research that we did, we found Hunter's original FBI file, and it has handwritten notes by J. Edgar Hoover.
No kidding.
To keep tabs. And, you know, when you think about threats to the establishment, when it comes to ideas and ideology, that's where it can be a really scary thing for the people in power.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I really admire about Ginsberg and Burroughs and Hunter and others is that they were constantly coming up with new ideas, breaking down barriers, mashing things up, cutting things up.
Yeah.
Instead of doing something on one side, why not do it on both sides? Why not, destroy boundaries?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting.
So, I mean, when we think of like disruptive innovation now, it's actually more tied to the capitalist notion of the startup. So these guys, in a certain sense, were using ideological tools to dismantle many of the conservative moments of that time period. Amusingly enough, many of the issues that they were dealing with come out of a critique of mainstream culture. And so, from the viewpoint of the underworld or underground, at that time, Burroughs writing his novels was shocking. Everything, in hindsight, when something was shocking, you're like, from our perspective, it's like, we could turn on Netflix and see far more shocking stuff at this point. But
there's still some passages by Burroughs that would shock anyone today. I assure you.
Probably, yeah.
And,
does anything shock anymore? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Let's see, yeah.
I don't know. I can't think of anything that really shocked me except Trump being reelected.
Yeah.
Well, there's some detailed descriptions of alien rectal mucus and that take,
That would just be the movie Alien,
Well, true.
Something bursts out of your stomach.
I think one of the things we also like to do with our talks is if there's anyone who has any particular questions, we've kind of assembled experts in the field here. If you have anything that you'd like to know more about. Bernie?
Did you guys address Burroughs' fascination with guns?
Sure.
Because it's a pretty contradictory topic
Well,
for the
it's-
time
Yeah.
and now.
Yeah.
Well, he grew up with them, He was a Boy Scout. He was out in St. Louis. His uncles took him hunting, etc. And I often have to explain this to Europeans living in Paris who really, guns are very distant things from their life. So they tend to have the impression that he went really far out of his way to be so involved with guns. And for the record, he did make considerable efforts to arm himself, etc. But the bottom line, it was for better or for worse, often for worse, that was just something that he always considered to be almost as ordinary as like the hammer in your drawer. Hanging up a picture was like the gun in the closet to defend yourself or whatever. That said, he went through a lot of different phases of how those applied to his life, and obviously, as a kid, doing outdoors type activities, and then later in life, living different places where feeling he needed that for defense, which was the case in Mexico City, but that went horribly wrong because in a drunken game of William Tell with his wife, he killed her, and he, spent the rest of his life hating himself for that. But years later, he came back to America and rediscovered the gun, and spent a lot of time out in the country in Kansas. But instead of sure, he definitely had some paranoid thoughts and definitely wanted to be armed in case anyone attacked him, and understandable also for a strange gay man in the mid-20th century who felt threatened many times in his life. But most notably, what happened later in his life was those guns became paintbrushes. He decided to use these weapons of destruction as tools of creation. And so what you see, like in this gallery, for example, was his works of art he created with guns. And he's basically taking automatic painting processes to another level using a tool that he had at his side most of his life, basically to tap into the chaos like anyone do. Jackson Pollock, of course, is, splattering his paint around because that's inviting the chaos of the universe. And Burroughs wanted to go a little further and like bring a little more chaos into that picture and get a little farther into the rabbit hole of whatever the unknown is. And that was a lifelong quest of his to search like the Nagual or the magical universe. And for him, you would use these explosive blasts to remove any chance of a nice, clean, linear logic, just to create these visual forms that he could never predict, and therefore he felt offered him a great opportunity to see into the unknown.
And to follow up on what Yuri was just saying, the gun thing. I'm from Washington D.C., which was the murder capital at a certain point. There was all sorts of violence. The right-wing perspective of guns versus a left-wing, there's a kind of like a paradox because the right-wing generally uses guns as a Second Amendment kind of notion of liberty and like militarized response to what they view as a critique of the nation state. So militias, small bands of usually white guys going crazy with guns. And so those kinds of weird situations in America, statistically speaking, a white male with a gun is dealing with some issues. So I think Burroughs was kind of doing that as a meditation on probably the violence that he would see around. And also in his own life, the tragedy of the murder of his wife or accidental death through shooting lingers over his family and so on. So those kind of paintings, you could also call chance process works, which in the art world has a very long tradition. There's also automatic poetry, and so other groups of, like most of the French were doing a lot of innovation with that. And so machine poetry, things like that. So amusingly enough, one of the most famous groups that in the 1915s was called the Italian Futurists, who were also regretfully ended up leading to Mussolini. But the Italian Futurists would use the sound of gunfire, the sound of machines to make what they call futurist music. And these are all art movements, and again...
And one of Burroughs' best friends, Gibson, who we mentioned, actually made music and poetry, the Pistol Poem.
Yeah, Pistol Poem.
And created music with the sound of gunfire. So, yeah, they definitely explored the artistic potential of these things. And I mean, there's no easy answer, though, to answer your question.
It's a paradox.
It's definitely a paradox, and it's definitely...
Yeah, I mean, for Alan, it was definitely a hard pill to swallow. I find Alan sort of embarrassingly tying himself and not trying to sort of defend Williams' position on guns. At the same time, Alan was a consummate pacifist who didn't believe in guns at all.
Yeah, so these
or any
two...
sorts of weapons. And it's funny to have them in the same room, but Alan would periodically buy one of these lines that William would be like, well, if guns were illegal and only outlaws would have guns or something like that. Or,
I don't want to live in a world where only the outlaws and the police have guns.
And I would be like, for the love of God, Alan, just, back off that one just a little bit. But it's just funny to see that.
Was Burroughs in the military?
Was Barry?
No.
He tried.
He tried to enlist, actually.
It was like 2 weeks
He was doing World War II.
I think he tried to enlist.
Yeah,
and was
he
turned
did.
away.
He tried for the Air
the war
Force.
had some influence on his obsession with guns, maybe?
I don't think so. No, it was a very limited,
self-defense.
He basically,
Was he in the NRA?
We were just talking about this,
I don't
and
know.
he definitely,
I think he may have had membership. I don't know.
he definitely received things in the mail from the NRA. I know from working through his archive.
Oh, yeah,
he
he's
had
a
a right back-
Second Amendment person, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
And by the way, you guys all feel free to chime in. I mean, this is kind of like a living room session, so we're happy to.
Anyone else out here have any
Can you speak on
questions
like,
here? Oh yeah.
the homosexual activism?
Yeah.
Ginsberg and Burroughs.
Yeah. So repeat the question so they can.
Yeah, you might want to
speak up.
Sorry, the homosexual activism behind Ginsberg and Burroughs.
It's interesting. What about the as much as you can consider them in the vanguard of gay rights, neither of them were really direct gay activists. So I mean, Alan, I don't think ever marketed a single gay parade, but he just so happened to be at the recording studio around the corner from Stonewall on the last night of the riot. So he actually went and walked around that night. He was one of the first sort of poets on the scene. But I mean, he was just openly gay, and I think that in itself, he just wrote about it with such ease in his own poetry, and that in itself became an act of gay activism.
Yeah, totally. I think the same thing with Burroughs. Sure, I mean, he actually was very scared for much of his early life of being exposed as gay, and I mean, eventually, of course, came out of the closet in his own way. But the greatest activism he did was not censoring himself. He had gay thoughts and he made gay art, and he did not censor that.
Is this after his wife's death or before?
Oh,
No,
both.
after.
What? What was the question?
I mean, the writing, most of his writing.
But he was gay when he was married to her?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and he was still attracted to women as well. Like, you could say bisexual, he identified as homosexual, but he did have some romantic relationships with women. And was known to compliment women's breasts later in life, I'm told. But, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kerouac was like kind of switched too.
He was like 90%, but I think Alan was just incredibly pushy.
Yeah, Alan. That's
Sometimes.
when I first met him. Alan Ginsberg had a very. As a heterosexual male, amusingly enough, I met him at Tony Shafrazi's gallery when Julian Schnabel had an opening, and he kind of made a beeline over to me, and he used to hang out in the art, openings.
Oh yeah, Alan was always
He was
there,
friends with Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon. They would bring him around, and he was very slightly aggressive about.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Sexual
He was like a little aggressive, sometimes a little bit persuasive.
Yeah.
A very big flirt.
Yeah, and he kind of liked younger males. I mean, at that time I was in my 20s, and I was like, I strictly like women, so I was like,
I think Alan had a story about Jack. I think Jack finally at one point just said, he's like, all right, if you just shut up, I'll, we can get it on or something like that. So.
I'll jump in and say that one of the really cool thing that Peter works on with the Allen Ginsberg is they have this amazing Instagram page, and it's Allen Ginsberg official.
Oh yeah.
And
Should I read that Hunter Thompson quote?
The reason I brought it up was I was thinking about the Johnny Depp thing, because Alan, he takes these amazing photos, and then he would do these beautiful handwritten kind of captions below the photos, and they post every day or every other day or every couple days, and they're really insightful. But on the same topic, there's Johnny Depp in Alan's kitchen, and he says, he keeps trying to hold my hand and get closer to me, and he says, well, I think that really what Alan wanted was affection, and to give it and to feel it and to be close to people. And Johnny Depp kind of picked up on that.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really colorful, but I also wanted to highlight this unique form of art that Alan did with his photography, where he'd have this beautiful shot. That was part of the art, but also the written words in his cool handwriting, it makes the whole thing kind of come together.
Right. You'll have a picture of Jack Kerouac on the fire escape, which is probably one of his most famous photographs. But he started. I think Robert Frank sort of gave him the idea to write, to explain the picture a little bit underneath. But he would date it. He would say he was in it, where it was, and then he started to write a little more about it. Then he turned it into this craft. He was like, well, this was when Jack was writing Dr. Sachs, so he was just finished with the Subterraneans, and William was staying here. He had just come out from Mexico, writing the Hale letters. Gregory Corso just started coming, and after about 10 years of writing these, they'd get so big that we'd have to print the image smaller and smaller, so we'd have big enough border for him to tell the story. But the stories, he made a point of never recreating the same one twice. So he'd have photocopies of all the different captions in front of him, and then he'd come up with a completely unique one for the next one. But they actually became really, really wonderful works of art themselves that people wouldn't see unless you either bought a print or had the photo books. So Instagram sort of become like a wonderful way to share those.
Yeah, I would ask you to share, Peter. We've seen these amazing drawings by Ginsberg that's never been seen, and he's rarely spoken of as a visual artist. His photography, sure, to an extent, but I want to know if you have any anecdotes, or if you seeing Alan draw, or what was his drawing process like? His doodles, like.
I mean, I don't know where a lot of the doodles that we have here, they were. I think most of these happened like when he was at a board meeting for the Buddhist organization that he was at, and he would because he would write where he was and what he was doing. It's usually like that kind of a.
Yeah, and on the back of those drawings are actually letters too.
When sometimes, charities would often write asking for something like a signature, so Alan would go out of his way and just do like he had like 3 themes he usually had. Was like a Buddha, or a dragon that was ejaculated.
Yeah,
or,
there's one right there.
So, for example.
Dragon coming.
Right.
Did you actually see him make these drawings though?
Yeah, he would, and actually, most often you saw those when he would sign books for people. So it's like his photograph book came out. 12 Trees did this beautiful coffee table edition. And Alan would just sit there. He asked the autographee. You're like, okay, so what do you do? You look at your name, and you just do this full, either a frowning sunflower or a Buddha or this dragon thing.
So he had some kind of icons and symbols that he would go back to, but I just imagined him kind of this joyous, playful way of making.
Yeah, he's sort of giggling half the time. I suppose.
Was he?
Right. So Burroughs, what's the snake eating its tail? Was another
Burroughs.
one.
Oh yeah.
Burroughs. So,
How did you become part of the? How did you end
It
up
was a
leading
series
these
of
things?
happy accidents. I met him in Morocco in Boulder, where I grew up. I just happened to be taking music classes at Morocco, which is the school he helped to found in the 1970s with Ann Waldman. There was like a whole liberal arts college that John Cage
it
was
still is, and it's amazing. It's in Boulder.
Meredith.
Tell the world.
There's a lot of wonderful people. But it was right in my backyard, and I just sort of got mixed up with all of those. But those were the Wild West days. They would have the summer writing program every summer. They would have parties like every other night. Poetry readings with Mary Baraka, Gregory Corso, Long Burroughs, So you'd have these wild Friday night readings, after parties. And I just kind of got mixed in with that crowd. 6 years later, I was traveling through New York and needed work, and asked if they needed help at his office, and I just started working there. I happened to be just part of the crew that took over taking care of his estate after he died. This was in 1997, so I started working with his office in 92. So in some capacity, I've just sort of inherited all these positions. Got to know Yuri through that, Paul, of course. DJ. It's just sort of. I always like to say Alan's the gift that keeps on giving, because through him, there's so many doors open. He sort of engenders so much goodwill that you just they're like, oh, you're working on a project with Alan. Oh, terrific! That's great. What do you want to do? And then boom. So
there's good vibes built into the Alan projects.
Completely.
Yeah. Would you care to dive in any deeper to the whole aspect of Chogyam Trungpa and the founding of Naropa, and how Naropa brought all these people together?
Right.
Probably that was a unique union of circumstances that solidified Burroughs and Ginsberg and Corso and Kerouac and Snyder and Ann Waldman, the whole crew, centered around the Buddhist movement back then.
Right. I mean, it was very sort of, it was almost like the entire American avant-garde were invited out one summer, 1974, to start this liberal arts college. Chogyam Trungpa escaped Tibet in 1959, came to the United States through England. He started teaching in the 70s, but was dirt poor, but somehow attracted a group of young acolytes that were really fascinated with the Tibet through his teachings. for Trumpa, he thought for these Western students in the 60s, they were all sort of still strung out on acid, kind of like in outer space. He thought a liberal arts college would help train students to express the feelings and their meditation experiences as they sort of evolved along the meditation path. So they invited as many sort of the American avant-garde as they possibly could. People like John Cage, who were already sort of heavily involved in Zen, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen. I think the list is like Ram Dass. I mean, I guess it was anybody who sort of had any sort of affiliation with Eastern religions by that time, but the list is pretty astonishing. It's 1974. Many of those people came back in 75, and by then it had become pretty established as a liberal arts college, and it got accredited by the mid-1980s. And now it officially goes by Naropa University, but it's just never produced any financially stable students enough to really get an endowment in place, so it's been struggling to just survive off of
You're talking about some of the names.
So yeah, they did 25 years anniversary of On the Road. This was like 7 years after they 7 years after this started, but this is August 1942. But Ferlinghetti, Robert Curley, Michael McClure, who is the poetry teacher for Jim Morrison in Close, and he traveled a lot with Ray Manzarek, for instance. But Alan, Abby Hoffman, Tim Leary, of course, came. Tim was coming a lot of those years. Robert Frank, they actually got him to come out. Diane DePrimo, one of the true greats. David Amram, composer. So yeah, and many others. So,
Yeah, and the story continues. It mentioned briefly that I was delighted to discover that Ann Waldman and others at Naropa have gone through enormous effort to basically find all of these recordings of these lectures of all these folks. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of audio recordings of lectures that were given in Naropa by of course Burroughs and Ginsberg and all these cats that we can all listen to right now on archive.org.
Yeah, that's right.
Archive.org, Naropa. Get enlightened, get educated. It's really amazing what's out there for free thanks to these people in Naropa.
Yeah.
Let's put Josh Goldsmith on the spotlight. Do you have any questions, Josh?
What do you think of this, Josh?
I don't. I'll get back to you.
Okay. Anybody else?
How about Bob? Bob's got some Ginsberg stories, huh?
All right.
Spin it around.
I found everyone in Alice when Burroughs picked up a handgun. How come they all dove into the ground?
Because it wasn't a very good shot.
I want to.
Was it Dave?
Yeah.
Well, he asks why people dove. And I hadn't heard that particular anecdote, but and I don't have a clear answer for you. I mean, and I'm not going to say he was the best shot in the world, but he wasn't the worst. And in general, from the stories I've heard, that he was pretty well trained with firearm safety, but I can't vouch for how well he stuck to that. That said, he was pretty well trained in other types of safety, and just a quick divergent anecdote: the fact that this man, was plagued for much of his life with a drug addiction, and also a gay man living in New York City in the early '80s, and he never got AIDS. He never, he lived to the age of 83, despite having lived on the edge that whole time. And that's partly because he studied medicine in Vienna as a young man, just briefly, as in one of his short little subplots of his life. He studied a little bit of medicine, and so he was always very, with the things he had studied, he was pretty vigilant about making sure he crossed his T's and dotted his I's. But I'm not going to vouch for his behavior at Alpha Farm. I have no idea.
And I've got two quick,
whatever it takes to get you through.
two quick anecdotes, and I don't know the truthfulness of this, but somebody once told me that when Burroughs was in New York and there was obviously kind of a heroin scene going on and a lot of abuse and experimentation. Somebody told me once that anyone who would ever shoot junk with Burroughs, they would always have such deference and respect to him that they would give him the first shot.
Yeah, well, he demanded it, from what I hear.
He always does.
And,
Oh, really?
and
Okay.
so when a lot of his friends and associates started dying of AIDS, Burroughs never did because he was always the one to do it first. And then it would get passed around later. But one other thing I want to mention here, and it's a connection, Peter really eloquently talks about Boulder as this place of, thought and all these amazing people coming together. And I want to give a little shout out to Lawrence, Kansas, where Burroughs spent the last few decades of his life. And Yuri and I met in Lawrence, and I've always thought Lawrence is this amazing place, and I call it a blanket of stars and a prairie of darkness. And a lot of amazing things happened in Lawrence, whether it be John Brown and the abolitionists starting the Civil War, or hippies in the late 60s and activists burning down the Union and the National Guard getting called in. A lot of weird,
Because of
amazing-
racial injustice, they were fighting against.
because of racial injustice. And Lawrence was actually one of the closest places to armed revolution in America in the late 60s and early 70s. And
You could say the Civil War started there because the Free Staters going out there to stop the spread of slavery from Missouri.
Yeah.
And a lot of stories.
Yeah,
But I
and-
think that resistance, I like to think sometimes that Burroughs settling there, he had some fondness for that history of resistance.
Oh, yeah.
And another small anecdote is that Hunter Thompson, he went to Lawrence to pay respects and to meet Burroughs. And, they had an interesting relationship, and I've done some research into how much they actually collaborated, and they did. They put on an art show at the Woody Creek Art Studio with David Floria as the curator.
Yeah.
Burroughs' paintings alongside Hunter's gunshot works. And Hunter went to Lawrence and gave him this very famous 50 caliber
Desert Eagle.
and
It's like a handgun like this big,
and apparently when Burroughs shot it,
Oh, yeah.
it kind of cocked back, and I think he even cut his hand, and he said, "The damn thing bit me." And and there was all these great things that happened in Lawrence in the early 90s, and Ralph Steadman came to Lawrence, and Ralph Steadman photographed William with his Polaroids, and then integrated those Polaroids into a piece of artwork called Something New Has Been Added that we have on display here. And Ralph Steadman had said to Burroughs, "Hey, I admire you, I want to collaborate." And Burroughs said, "Okay, you make the print, I'll shoot it." So they had collaborated during that time, and then Hunter came to Lawrence, and they stayed at the Eldridge Hotel. And I just love the idea of Steadman, Burroughs, Hunter, all sort of getting together in Lawrence,
Yeah,
Kansas,
Alan
of all
too.
places, and Allen.
Did you visit Lawrence with Alan?
Alan and I were never in Lawrence together at the same
Okay.
time for whatever reason. Yeah, I don't know if Alan was there for that trip when Hunter was there. That was like
No, he wasn't there for that.
no, that was like September of '93, I think that it was.
Yeah.
Because I came like a week later and heard all the stories about the good times that everybody had.
Yeah. So, and Hunter's art, Hunter made a series of gunshot paintings, about 30 of them total. And I like to think that, there's this great history of gunshot art when it goes back to Nicky de Saint-Phal in Paris with Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. And then Burroughs with his famous gunshot doors and his exhibit at Shafrazi Gallery, which was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, which we have one of those works from, is the debut exhibition in 1987.
1987, right.
And then
Madonna came in and bought some works.
and then maybe was it Picasso that said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. I think Hunter saw what Burroughs was doing and took his own twist on it.
Sure.
But I think there's this great connection between all these kind of heroes of the
Wait, so
counterculture.
Burroughs was doing shotgun art before Hunter?
Burroughs was doing
Yeah,
it well before
definitely.
Hunter.
82 he started.
I have a question for DJ speaking. I'm sorry you already talked about this, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about 222 Bowery. I live just a few blocks from there. What that scene was like, and also if you could say more about the influence on musicians like Bjork and Laurie Anderson.
So just by way of context, the Bowery was, I don't know if anybody ever saw, can I get a beer?
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
The Bowery used to be this kind of like thuggish underworld spot. In fact, it was called the 5 Points because there was a bunch of gangs there. And New York had gone through a tremendous amount of corruption. It was called Tammany Hall. So the 5 Points boys, and there was like small Irish gangs and like weird Irish underworld, Italian mafia stuff. And then the Bowery, after the 70s, the Bowery, New York had gone through a huge financial crisis. And the municipal government was broke, and Ford famously said New York dropped dead. There's a very famous kind of image of that during the financial crisis. So the Bowery then had a lot of homeless junkies and like weird, just downtown stuff. And I used to DJ at a club called Save the Robots, which was a couple blocks over on Avenue B and 2nd Street, in around 96, 97. But by the time I moved to New York from Paris, I'd heard about it, and the new museum later on started hosting events there and stuff like that. But recently, I did a quick conversation with a very renowned science fiction writer named William S. Burroughs. William Gibson.
William Gibson.
There's so many Williams. But William Gibson wrote a science fiction novel called Neuromancer, which is, if you haven't read it, it's an absolute classic. But he traces a lot of his lineage back to Burroughs. And says, like, if you could imagine Burroughs becoming digital, he coined the term cyberspace, for example, and it was meant to reflect a lot of the digital implications of Burroughs's Nova Express and other kinds of creating this universe out of language and code. So the Bowery in the 90s was just regrouping after the wave of heroin and after municipal collapse. So it used to be really bombed out, a lot of graffiti, a lot of kids just smashed out after a night of partying. And when I first moved to New York, I was throwing wild parties throughout downtown, and we'd take over an empty space, much like what DJ's doing here. One of the spaces that I did was called the gas station, and it was a bombed out gas station that used to be a Safeway. And so we set up a sound system, parties, most notoriously, remember this band G.G. Allen and the Murder Junkies? He died in the living room.
G.G. Allen. He died
in the living room.
Yeah.
So it was a really wild time, the 90s.
Yeah.
So my parties started getting much wilder, and artists started coming a lot. Like Yoko Ono would come out, and you'd see her at 2 a.m, sitting, hanging out. So a lot of other artists, it was meant to be a wild art party. And so we'd take over crazy spaces and throw an event. We'd have poetry, we'd have music, and those kinds of events became popular. So that's why I ended up meeting Ginsberg's and Burroughs' scene, because a lot of those folks, Laurie Anderson, most famously, she would come by as well, and all sorts of people.
Yeah, but and John Giorno, who lived there, epic
Giorno,
poet.
Right, so Giorno then inherited the space somehow, because a lot of people would be hanging out at the 222 Bowery. It was generally an older scene at that time, but
1950, Mark Rothko actually had a space.
It was his old space.
Right. And the whole building was a YMCA from the 1890s on. So in Williams floor, there was still a row of urinals there. They were from the boys' school.
There's a pool downstairs.
Boys' school. Oh, so you know about the pool. Yeah, the Mark Rothko room is this big, huge 2-story thing in the back that's been sort of sealed off since the 60s.
Yeah, it's still sealed off.
Anyway, that's just a side story. But.
Yeah, the space is now a pop-up gallery. Actually, DJ, we should talk about it, because they were doing pop-up stuff. We should bring this to New York. But so this was like you got to remember the Bowery. New York now is kind of clean and all cleaned up. The wilder stuff has moved out to Brooklyn. The young people have moved to Brooklyn. But
there's a Whole Foods across the street.
Yeah, there's a Whole Foods and all this stuff now. So it's all clean and
nice.
Yeah, the 90s, New York was a lot more gritty, right?
I mean, even the 90s, I thelt New York was cleaning up by then, but relatively speaking, it was still pretty gritty.
Alphabet City area, Tompkins Square, Bowery was still pretty gritty. But these guys thrived on that, and they would throw like literary stuff. And so one band that helped champion Ginsberg quite a bit in the underground or downtown was Sonic Youth. So they were friends of mine as well. So Thurston plays guitar on a lot of my albums. So they would bring Alan around whenever they heard about something new.
You know that story about something Thurston was like, well, Alan would just show up at CBGB sometimes with his harmonium and just get on stage between sets while bands were changing. And he'd start chanting this just stuff, and he's like, you just couldn't heckle that. People were like, what the hell is this?
So he was on the scene.
That was so just like completely sweet and innocent.
Right. And he was a little bit more in the rock scene, I was more in the DJ scene, which is electronic and more late night. Like my parties wouldn't even start till like 2 a.m. The world used to be a different place. I mean, it's like these days nobody goes out to 2 a.m.
What's a party?
Yeah. I was definitely after hours. You remember Save the Robots?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So I went there a couple times.
Yeah, I used
before
to DJ.
I was like a little too young.
Yeah, it was, and there was a lot of like after hours, like people.
Well, that was like 7 a.m. to 10 a.m.
Yeah,
right?
you'd still be partying like 7, 8, 9 a.m. or stuff like that.
So what was Alan's like if he was cruising? If he was cruising New York, what would?
He would just.
He'd go to some Art World dinner party, probably an opening.
Yeah, he'd drop by a place on the way back. There was brownies, there was CBGBs, there was.
What was that restaurant in the meatpacking district everybody would go to in the morning?
Florent.
The Florent.
Oh,
he used to go there.
Yeah,
like
Florent's
the
gone.
late night.
It's
Like he was kind of between late night vibe and then weird Art World stuff.
Talking about him and Art World stuff, I'm curious, because obviously he had extensive dialogue and friendship with so many incredible artists.
Yeah.
Is there anything that stands out in your memory that you want to mention? I mean, obviously Clemente. There's even a work in here where he does an imitation of Clemente.
Right.
I just wonder if there's other visual artists that pop into your head.
Lichtenstein.
Well, George Condo.
Yeah.
He was quite close to George Condo. He's sort of well known in certain areas, but Francesco Clemente, Larry Rivers. That's another. Larry Rivers.
Laurie
I
Anderson.
feel like some people don't.
Keith Haring.
Keith Haring, I don't know.
Basquiat?
I mean, they knew each other, and I don't know in Basquiat, but I remember I was walking down when I was first visiting New York, and I was like, oh, Keith Haring lives here, let's go. Let me look up the number in my address book. He's like, well, I don't know what buzzer it is, and some guy came out, and he's like, is Keith Haring here? And the guy's like, I don't know what you're talking about, and took off. So we never actually met him, but they were somewhat close,
But that was early 90s, mid 90s?
That was like late 80s.
Yeah, and he did collaborations with Burroughs. They did some pretty cool stuff in a series called The Apocalypse.
Keith Haring?
Yeah, Burroughs and Keith Haring Burroughs collaborated with Rauschenberg. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Philip Taft, I think. Both Philip and William Allen.
Yeah, which those works are in Paris right now, and they're going to be at Art Basel Miami.
Yeah.
The collaboration with Philip Taft and Burroughs.
Yeah. So, when Alan was dying, all these artists came over. Alan, sort of word got out that he was in a coma. He probably wouldn't last more than 24 hours, so everyone kind of came by to pay their respects in his loft space. So it's Francesco Clemente and Alba Clemente. We were sitting in the hallway smoking cigarettes, and George Condo came by, and Roy Lichtenstein, and then Philip Taft. It felt like we had like all of the New York City art scene in that one room at one point. And, it was. Alan finally kicked the bucket when Larry Rivers came down in pink pajamas because Larry lived right upstairs from him. And he started to play a saxophone. And a friend of ours was like, oh God, that probably sent Alan over the edge. And he finally kicked it. But Larry Rivers was always, I'm sorry, we could go overlook you. What did you?
It's all right. First, I'd like to say that I hung out in East Village in the early 90s.
Okay, so yeah.
And Sonic Youth pours from every fucking brick, everything there for me. I can walk down the street and see their music. Second thing, whatever happened to the Beans? I would think that Aspen would have some Beans and in the parks and stuff like that. People out there just bringing out the beat scene and bringing it to the people.
Yeah,
that's an idea.
Yeah, man.
I mean, no reason we can't. That's right.
That's all I'm saying.
There was a good be-in 1967 in Aspen, and Oscar Acosta and Hunter Thompson were there.
That's right.
That's right.
It feels like 2020. This is a new scene, right?
Right. I don't know why that, because after music festivals became such big events, maybe that's where sort of the actual
kind of
Lollapalooza.
Those seem to have attracted the large audiences doing. Some of them are somewhat spiritually centered or not. But if because I guess the first be-in you had the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, so it was kind of I guess maybe called co-opted by the music industry.
You say both you own the house in Galena tonight.
Oh yeah, right, exactly right. So,
So I don't know. I'm just saying, like, you know, I mean, maybe we could get some beings going on.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Yeah, totally. So
I like that.
Let's be a great thing here.
Yeah, quick note about Sonic Youth, by the way, we're talking about it, is they actually featured Williams' art on one of their album covers, which was really nice.
X-Ray Man.
Yeah.
X-Ray Man. Right,
And-
right. That's right.
And so it was really nice
Yeah.
that Burroughs appreciated their music and they they appreciated his visual art as well as his literary and helped to bring that to a larger audience.
You got a question back here?
Yeah.
DJ Spooky, I don't know if you're ever aware of this, but we were talking about the Bowery in the late 90s and stuff, and then DIY spaces, there was a space called C-Squad.
Oh yeah.
I remember that. Yeah, that's been a while. Okay.
Isn't it
yeah.
part of ABC No Rio?
Yeah, ABC No Rio was near there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
the next
actually become legitimate now.
Okay.
Yeah.
As far as, right, so kind of in that time period where the punk scene was sort of dying out,
Right.
and parties like yours were getting done. C-Squad was trying to get some money together. They would throw parties, charge people to get in the door, and there were at least 2 times that I went to where it was billed as one of the York parties, and like, people would pay to get through the door, and it was clearly not the party.
Well, they were using my name. Yeah, I mean that happens. There's a British DJ Spooky too who's copied my name a lot. It happens. But this whole spooky, the idea of spooky, amusingly enough, which I think from a 21st century perspective, and Burroughs, and again, Burroughs was a lot more of an influence in my thinking and my work, was the idea that you have this sort of an electromagnetic phantom, something that you press play and there's nothing there, but there's all this code. And a lot of his work influenced people from my perspective, like William Gibson, but also other the electronic music scene picked up on him in a different way than the rock scene. And so the rock scene was, like you were saying, the punk scene was dying, and there was a between this world's moment. With now everything's electronic music, and every kid is listening to hip hop or techno or dubstep or whatever. But the rock scene had their empire for a long time, and it was kind of fascinating because I remember when I picked up there's a very rare vinyl that Burroughs did with Kurt Cobain called The Preacher. The
Priest they called him.
The Priest they called him, and now it's a collector's item. You can sell on eBay for like a lot of money or something. And the Lower East Side had all these kind of hybrid rock, electronic. And so Thurston Moore, for me, it was usually someone I work with quite a bit. And Kim Gordon and those guys. It's always a tricky thing to see. Also the racial politics. Guys, I also work with Amiri Baraka pretty extensively as well. So downtown was a kind of an experimental place where all these different people would collaborate, or late night, you never knew who would walk through the door at some weird after hours party. And that's what made it, I think, a very unique moment in New York, which hasn't. The 90s, the cool thing about Burroughs and Ginsberg's spirit hanging over that was many of the issues that they had written about. We had faced a downtown in fear of AIDS, a downtown that was recovering from the Reagan administration, and then you had the Clinton administration, and all this, then you had the Iraq War. And a lot of people were kind of in this moment that downtown represented this little bubble, and then Giuliani, who's a lunatic who's still running around. I can't believe every time I see Giuliani. It's just
headache.
Yeah, he enacted what they called the cabaret law. I don't know if he actually made dancing illegal. Do you remember? It was actually.
It's always been on the books, but like every so often, every few decades, they try and reinforce it.
Yeah. Yeah, and remember, there was actually a really interesting club called the Cooler. Remember the Cooler?
Yeah. Right.
Where they had poetry and people would come through late night, kind of, and Nuyorican Poets Cafe.
Yeah.
They were the meatpacking district was over on the west side, but it was crazy spaces, and the Lower East Side spaces were. What would you say the difference? The texture, like
I don't know. Somehow the Lower East Side places were pretty established. I feel like the meatpacking area started to become open to DIY spaces. That's what then it became but that was kind of the beginning of that. Yeah.
So Burroughs left New York, and Alan stayed. And I'm really curious if you witnessed Alan or have sentiments of how Alan felt about William leaving New York and settling in Kansas, going out to the Wild West.
Right.
And Alan was obviously never tempted to do a move away from the city? He always wanted to stay there?
Alan was never going to leave New York. I mean, he was a New Yorker. I mean,
Totally.
he was, grew up across the river in New Jersey.
Was he
but,
disappointed that Burroughs went out west?
I don't think so. I think I would have heard about it. I think Alan was instrumental in getting Burroughs to return to New York in 1974.
From Europe, yeah.
From Europe, yeah.
Yeah,
And,
England, I guess, at the time.
And there he was actively.
Oh, actually, yeah, and Burroughs was in a dark spot in England.
Right.
And, you make a good point, and Alan freaking saved him right there. It was a real good friend. Like, hey, man, I can help you out. We're going to do some writing and do some teaching and come back to New York, come back to America. And then William stayed for a while, and then he moved out west to Kansas. And I always wondered if Alan was
That's funny. He was only in New
sad
York
to see him
for
go.
10 years. No doubt he was. Yeah. I don't see him having been ever resistant to the idea.
But they also spent time together in Colorado because and Burroughs almost moved to Boulder. And I think he, from what I hear, the altitude was a bit much for him, and and he liked, Lawrence reminded him of St. Louis where he grew up or whatever.
Yeah. Right, I think it's Billy Jr., William's son, was living in Boulder, off and on, switching between San Francisco and Boulder. This is probably 1974 to 1982 when William Jr. died. But I think a good part of he had his liver transplant in Colorado, so William was going back there a lot from New York before he moved to Kansas.
And Alan was spending a good amount of time in Europa. I mean,
Alan,
correct me if I'm wrong.
Alan actually lived in Boulder from 1978 to about 1982.
Yeah.
I think but he would go back to New York periodically.
So that's nice to mention that Colorado connection. Right?
Yeah. I mean, that was his sole responsibility, was to try and make Europa become a real school.
Yeah.
And I think all the teachers that were teaching there were basically volunteering their time. And it just was, after a while, it just wasn't feasible for Alan to live in Boulder and try and do
But that's a good run, 4 years.
That's 4 years, yeah, definitely so.
And those two guys spent considerable time. Were you ever in Colorado with those two? I mean, you talk about being in Europa, but I remember you met.
I met them in 1985, both of them. So
yeah,
and that was in Europa. So yeah.
I'm gonna, I think, break in. I think that's. How do you guys feel? I mean, I feel like I think we covered a lot of bases.
How about everybody just do a quick closing statement?
Yeah, quick closing statement, and then
thank you guys.
we are gonna have one live poem read by our friend Seamus here. He's gonna do a poem after our closing statements, and go for it.
No.
You want me to start?
Yeah.
You.
Okay. So. I just want to say how grateful I am to have these wonderful friends, new friends, old friends, great friends, bad friends, in between friends, outlaws. We're lucky to live in this town and to have this sort of culture in Aspen where we can talk about ideas, and there's a great history in Aspen that goes back to the Aspen Institute and Walter Pepke, and bringing philosophers, bringing poets, bringing artists together and to get cross-pollination. And I think it's really important to hear different ideas and different perspectives. And that's one of the things that really touched me about this exhibit, and the idea of these two men and their lives together and intertwined in so many different ways, and so different but yet best friends. And I think that that's a lesson that we should all keep. And I like to personally keep friends with people that I don't agree with, just for that. And in this age of echo chambers and Facebook manipulation, we're all kind of closed off. And I think it's important to keep open mind and open ears to people that have different ideas and different thoughts about what life is about. And I think that it's really important, and obviously a lot of us are on the same page, but I think that we should all make an honest effort to broaden our horizons and think different thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, boy.
Right. I can't follow that. So I'm going to defer, but I basically just read books, immerse yourself in art, and learn to meditate. All right, guys.
Sounds good, and amen to all that, and thanks to DJ also for giving a venue for this, and I'm so happy to be able to work with you to put this show together, because it's been a long time coming of thinking like there's some beautiful stuff out there and some important stuff that's ever more important today that needs to get put out there in the eyes of the public and in the ears of the public and in the throats of the public. I want to hear from everybody else and all their reactions, and just the beat must go on. So it's up to you, it's up to us. Let's keep it going.
Cheers, man. I just want to say that art is about potentiality, and there's so many issues that these two gentlemen's work touches on that actually is resonant with our 21st century crisis of democracy. At the moment, we're in an era where this election coming up is probably going to be one of the most important elections in human history. The climate crisis, the financial crisis, this bio crisis. We're in an era of biopolitics. And the issues that linger over some of the works that Burroughs wrote, Cities of the Red Night, the Ticket That Exploded, Naked Lunch, and Nova Express, they're eerily resonant with this crazy summer. And so as we wrap up, I just want everyone to realize that these are places where art intersects with politics, and there's no way that you can say that these gentlemen were not political. There also has to be a kind of a rear view mirror that says that what is possible because of the spaces these gentlemen opened up is something that we still are kind of grappling with. The culture wars that Trump is, doing with the Confederate statues, for example, or the secret police in Portland, Oregon, or the list could go on. I mean, there's where the Trump administration, and even, long story. So with that said and done, my two pieces are portraits of them. They're the barcode pieces. They're called Coded Language. And I've shown with quite a few different galleries and museums over the years. This one came across as a kind of a conversation. I walked by the gallery and I was like, those are cool graphics. And we had a conversation. And so that's what the ancient Greeks would call dialectics, which again goes back to the poetic urge. So to me at least, I'm going to be in Aspen for the rest of the year, and I hope I can see everybody over the next, New York I'm kind of done with. So we'll just hopefully see you guys around over the next couple of months. And DJ, thank you for making your gallery make this happen.
Yeah. And now Seamus is going to do a live spoken word poem about the Haight-Ashbury. It's about 2 minutes long, and we wanted to do some action poetics, so we're going to give him the attention just to hear him rap. And one of the things that I'll just mention before he talks is that one of our good friends in town here said that, Ginsberg was maybe one of the first rappers because of the way he spoke his poems, and that he didn't really even speak his poems, he sang his poems. And so I love that idea, and so on that note, we'll let Seamus go.
So as ridiculous as it sounds, I've been labeled, not self-proclaimed, the 21st century beat poet. Whatever you believe or not, whatever, fine. This is called The Haight Street Shuffle. As always, my poems are true to true stories, no exceptions. I don't write fiction. My life is way too crazy to write anything false. That initial invasion of aggressors bear changing. The age of Aquarius are now complaining from the gentrified comfort of the neighborhood's Victorian townhouses, their birthrights, boxcar and thumb bum violence. This landmark of runaways and predators, safety pin patchwork and the psychedelic hordes of delusional enraptured, is the promise of shopping cart nut jobs enlightened, and all I have to say about the whole matter is, hey, welcome to your children. From the little plaza at the Haight Street end of Golden Gate Park, past Hepatitis Pond, the Tunnel Dark, then right on to Hippie Hill, the crusty traveler kids and junky patchoulis are mostly slinging hates. 1.6 grams of weed that they're about fluffed up to look like 3.5 in a bag. And even if it's weight, and most likely not, the price is always still a hard smile, $60, even if you get it from me. That lawfully ball, the three-pronged Sutro radio tower, red and white with the red blinking tips, like spikes waiting for the Trinity's heads, presides over the park's shooting gallery camp's Caucasian. A census proclaimed most of the park's homeless white trash, and the OD'd and murdered souls flurry in the catalyst wind at the top of the trees like a warning or seduction. as is the Hate's former dope house boutiques. There's sweatshop signs that candy fuck narcotic. And do these types of hypes ever come free from oppression? Oppression is our consent that keeps the world of these despotisms ironic. The only reason why anything happens in the human world is because people allow it. That's it.
On that note, as our first Liberty Salon in our new space, thank you all for being here, and thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you guys.
That was great. Yeah, I do.
Thank you guys for being here.
Good. I'm tired. I was getting sleepy there at the last minute.
Thank you.